Hello, everyone. To those who just joined, I see introductions already happening in the chat, which is wonderful. Welcome to this webinar on education financing in crisis, the role of data in breaking silos. IATI is thrilled to host this alongside the Education Cannot Wait Fund and the UNESCO GEM report. My name is Sonia Anderson and I work with IATI. I'm just going to share a couple reminders in terms of operating in the Zoom webinar function and then pass along. We have an exciting hour and a half for you prepared. So just a few points. You are muted because this is the webinar function, but we do really encourage you to interact, introduce yourself in the chat, and please post any questions you have. And for questions, you can use the chat function. You can also use the Q&A function. And our presenters will do their best to respond to your questions throughout the presentation. We will also have an interactive Q&A of about 25 minutes at the end of presentations. So with that, I will hand over to IATI's director, Dr. Faiza Hassan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome. My name is Faiza Hassan, and I'm the director for the Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies, and I will be your moderator today. It's amazing to see so many of you have joined us today for this session on education financing in crisis, the role of data in breaking silos. In terms of the setup for today, we'll begin with a framing of the issue by colleagues from ECW, which will then be followed by a presentation of the new findings from UNESCO and ECW. And then we will move into a panel discussion featuring insights from country-level colleagues and data experts. And then finally, we will open the floor for your questions before we close with key takeaways. So that is the setup for today. And with that, let's get started with the framing of the issue, and I'll hand over to Christian to take us through that. Over to you.
Great, thanks a lot, Faiza, and also a warm welcome from my side. So here it's a bit of framing. A few years back, when ECW developed its strategy, one gap that we observed and that our partners also observed, as you know, ECW is in the end not just a fund but a partnership platform. A gap in our EIEPC world was actually a lack of understanding of what total funding goes to crisis contexts. We have traditionally tracked EIE funding through systems like the FTS to understand what humanitarian funding goes to education, but there was a recognition always that a lot of development funding actually also goes to crisis-affected contexts. So therefore, there was a call for us to move the needle in partnership with key actors, such as the UNESCO GEM team, to understand better a more comprehensive view on EIE funding. So that was then put in the strategy in 2022 when we had these strategic planning discussions. So this initiative that some of you may have actually also heard about, a EIE financing observatory. So this is part of this larger move towards a better way, a more comprehensive way of tracking funding again in EIE crisis contexts. So the first part was to track funding to EIE, but actually then to go beyond that, to look at the development components and therefore enhance nexus coherence by having a stronger visibility on both humanitarian development aid that goes to crisis contexts. Next slide. Then came 25, our current year, which was kind of what we could say like the big shock moment in our architecture. Funding big sort of declines already that started earlier, but that seemed to accelerate much more than during 25. So there was a key study from the UNESCO GEM team that Yuki, my colleague here also on the call, will share also findings on. So in 24, 12% of ODA fell, and more actually is expected to fall, with projections by 27 of 25% cuts. So these would be the steepest decline since the 1990s. There was also a UNICEF paper recently that looked at actually these aid cuts and projections around that. For the humanitarian sector, a similar issue came. There was this humanitarian reset. So in 25, the original appeal calls, funding appeal calls, were much more reduced during the year 25 because there was a realization that the aid cuts would be so heavy that actually these asks themselves needed to be reduced. However, this didn't mean that these crises just disappeared. It's really a change in scope of what humanitarian education funding should ask for in such crisis settings. There was a foundational study from IATI Global Hub, Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies, and the cluster, looking at what that meant on the ground in terms of learning centers being shut down, refugees being left without schooling. And here are a few key figures. So that study highlighted what it meant sort of for education or EIE on the ground. All this led sort of even more to a call for we really need to move from a fragmented system of education aid tracking towards a more comprehensive system. But because in the end, in such an environment where there are such strong aid cuts, every dollar counts. Therefore, if we track all the funding that goes to a crisis context, we actually enhance the opportunities for more coordination and sort of really identifying better where funds should be allocated to meet the gaps that are there on the ground. Next slide. Such a comprehensive tracking and consolidated view on education funding in such crisis context would help us answer questions such as how much aid is flowing to the EIEPC sector across humanitarian and development donors. Another question that could be answered through such a more comprehensive system would be answering a question whether the gap that is left by cutting through the humanitarian reset humanitarian aid to such context, does the development funding actually come in and take sort of close some of those gaps that are left behind by changing the scope of humanitarian aid in these contexts? And more generally, actually, if we have greater insights on EIPC financing flows and gaps by country, by targeted group, by type of interventions, we could also enhance at global and country level the allocation of funds to really those areas that need these funds most. Next slide. So all these efforts would really help enhance sort of our advocacy for education aid in crisis context. It will ensure us to use the financing more effectively and help with coordination in such settings. Now let's look at the data sets. In the past, there were already studies that tried to link sort of the humanitarian aid in education aid with sort of the broader development aid. And the usual systems that were used for such analysis was the FDS financial tracking service from OCHA, which has the function of tracking against required appeal amounts, how much funding has been mobilized. And it's designed as a live system where reporting happens alive, and these and sort of the commitments against these appeal asks are tracked on a day-to-day basis. At the same time, you have OECD DAC that has a creditor reporting system, the CRS, that captures all funding, humanitarian development, in one system. However, that comes with a long delay of usually 2 years. And what the analysis usually found is separately on humanitarian funding, there would be a tracking of those results. We would from ECW report this in our annual results reports. For example, there were other reports from development initiatives, for example, that used all these findings to say something about humanitarian funding. But then there was always a statement that would say, yes, there's development funding in crisis context, and there would be some analysis maybe that would look at development aid for crisis affected countries, but then it wasn't clear, is this now what is the sector level funding that goes to those crisis contexts that comes from development and humanitarian settings. And there was no clear picture, joint picture of the totality of funding. And that's when we wanted to explore whether we could use the IATI initiative, the International Aid Transparency Initiative, which is an open data standard and reporting platform designed to improve transparency and coordination in development cooperation, that started about 15 years ago, to look at whether that system, which tracks also on a live basis all funding, but with clearer labels, whether we could leverage this look at that analysis, combining all these three data sets to get a more comprehensive picture. And for this initiative, we felt from ECW, the best partner to partner on this work is the UNESCO GEM team, which has been putting out excellent analysis on education aid over the years. The Education Finance Watch is a key publication that we often reference and we use, but over the years, it didn't really capture sort of what's the humanitarian funding component. So we had kind of the joint problem and the challenge that we wanted to solve. And therefore, this what you hear today, the analysis that happened sort of over the past 2 years, I would say, is extensive data analysis, digging into each of these data sets, looking at comparisons, what actually across these data sets we learn on sort of education aid, humanitarian, both development, going to crisis settings. These results are really the joint effort of the UNESCO GEM team and us from Education Cannot Wait. With this, I'm pleased to hand over to the UNESCO GEM team to say a few words. First, I think Catherine, I believe, and then Yuki. Is that right? Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Christian. Checking that I can be heard. I think I can. Yes, thank you. Just to present the GEM report very briefly, because we don't always speak on webinars about education and emergencies. So for those who don't know us, the Global Education Monitoring Report, or GEM report as we're known, has been going since 2002. Since then, we've been monitoring progress towards the global education targets and whatever the agenda is. And we were given a mandate in 2015, therefore, to monitor the targets in SDG 4. Below on this slide, you can see the different reports that we've produced since 2015, each of them looking at a different theme. And I think a very important thing to know about the GEM report is that while we are published and hosted by UNESCO, we are in fact editorially independent. So what is written inside the GEM report and all of our products is just written by the GEM report team sitting here in Paris. Thank you. Next slide. Outside of the global report that we produce almost every year, we do actually produce many other products and reports, regional or in many different languages and in all sorts of different themes, as you can see on this slide. But the reason why we're here on this webinar today is because of the work that we've been doing on education finance. There are 4 main buckets of work that we do on education finance, which you can see here. So the first is that, as Christian said, we've been monitoring the levels of aid to education since 2002. And since 2015, we've also been looking at the cost of achieving global education targets. So some of you may know the figure of there being a 97 or 100 billion finance gap for achieving SDG 4 targets. That was our latest analysis on the finance gap. Thirdly, we've joined forces with the World Bank and the UNESCO Institute for Statistics in the Education Finance Watch. where we pull together analysis on government budgets, which is from the World Bank, on aid to education, which is by us, and the household contributions to education as well, which is us. And it gives you a sort of full package on education financing. And then the last piece is a global mapping of countries' equitable finance mechanisms. These are done on our peer website, the logo for which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. But I guess the reason why we joined up with Education Finance Watch, Education Cannot Wait, excuse me, is in order to fill that tiny piece of the puzzle that we hadn't covered for a while, which was looking at how education in emergencies was being financed. And I'll pass you on to Yuki, my colleague, who carried out the work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you everyone, and hello, and thanks so much to the organizer for this webinar, and Christian. I'm just going to then follow up on what Christian actually spoke a little bit about our recent work on development aid overall. So the slide actually shows our latest findings on the development aid to education. The chart on the left uses IATI data plus the donor announcements recently and predicting what's going to happen up to 2027. And basically what's going to happen is after remaining stable and increasing over the years at around like 12 to 13 billion dollars overall, the total direct aid to education is now going to decline by almost a quarter by 2027. So this is like the first sign of this drop happens in 2024, and then followed by more decline in 2016 to 27. The chart on the right actually shows the data by recipient countries, and some, especially those are the countries that are more depending on the ODA in education, and mainly some of them are in mainly these countries are in Africa, situated in Africa, and in places like Chad, Liberia, and Mali, the ones that you see on the right. Their projected cuts would basically remove close to half of their current education aid overall. So the overall, over the years, this focus on finance naturally kind of led us to look more closely what's happening more comprehensively, not just those country education and in development, but education in crisis. And unfortunately, up until now, the data are still scattered between humanitarian and development. Next slide, please. As Christian also framed the overall objective of our analysis is to really understanding the data, the advantages of each database that we're going to use, and then finding what are the consistencies or inconsistencies in reporting, and how we can actually make use of those data to provide more transparency in terms of data reporting for not just the humanitarian or education in emergency, but also development in aid in general. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go a little bit more in more dive into the databases that we use. So there are three main global databases, as mentioned earlier, and in terms of the development, the OECD Creditors reporting system is by far the backbone of the official development assistance reporting. It is well structured, it has a long history, and it has a very standardized reporting mechanism, but the focus itself is very much like a development aid to education, and the humanitarian data is available, but it's set aside without the consistent labeling of education in emergency. It also has, because of it going through the rigid data validations mechanism, so that there's a delay, 2-year delay. And then the data itself is limited to, the submission itself is limited to bilateral and multilateral donor agencies in general. You are probably most familiar, the FTS. FTS tracks humanitarian and the humanitarian aid in general. The within and outside of UN coordinator peers, it is very timely. It focuses on pledges or commitment in general, more so than disbursement to actual programs and projects. Education sector is coded itself, so it does not require sorting as a second mechanism. And now we're going to talk a little more about the International Aid Transparency Initiative. It's an open platform where donors and agencies can publish transaction level data, so it's very granular. And education emergency is integrated as a label, and that would facilitate filtering. It is broad and a lot near real time, but the participation is still voluntary. So the donor coverage is still in progress. Time series or quality of data also, it depends on the commitment of the publisher. So in a nutshell, the CRS is structured but slow, the FTS is fast but narrow, and IATI is open and still in progress. But we can work on all of them together to see how what the complementarities and the gaps. Next one, please. So the methodology, the methodology to make the databases more compatible, we filter for education sector codes and added keyword searches for crisis-related terms, and while trying to avoid double counting issues, and then paying particular attention to pooled funds like GPE or ECW if necessary. And we then conducted 3 complementary analysis. So that at the global level, we looked at the global trend across CRS, FTS, and IATI. The country analysis focuses on 6 crisis-affected countries, namely Chad, Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Haiti. And further than that, the thematic analysis compared crisis-related tags with education subsectors to see how priorities like inclusion, displacement, and risk reductions are being addressed. Next one, please. So I'm gonna go directly into the findings. The slide highlights the findings from the CRS analysis on EIEPC education in emergency and protracted crisis. The chart itself looks at the distribution of EIEPC financing and in all aid to education in crisis-affected countries by type of data, by type of aid. So the blue bar shows development aid, and then the orange bar shows the humanitarian aid. As you can see, over time, the development share has become much larger. And for example, in 2016 and 2017, the humanitarian aid made up about, let's say, 1/3 of the total. And by 2023, the development aid, so the blue bar, accounted for more than 90%, and the humanitarian aid basically dropped to about 8%. This partly reflects the fact that many crises have become long-term, so the education support is channeled through development programs. It also reflects how the data are recorded in CRS. For example, like multi-year or system strengthening activities are reported as development rather than humanitarian within the CRS system. The second point is the EIE. It's basically looking at a little bit even a wider perspective. So the share of total education aid, which combining both the humanitarian and development component that goes to crisis-affected countries, the share actually rose from 9% in 2016 to 12% overall in 2023. This is not shown as a chart, but in countries, especially among the countries with humanitarian responses plans lasting more than 3 years, the share increased from 21% to 24%. So we can see that almost 1/4 of all external education financing actually goes to countries affected by crisis. Next one, please. Now, so the analysis of CRS, is it creditable? Is it comparable to IATI? So I looked at the two databases by donors and also by total volume. And IATI obviously updates faster, so we have a data up to 2024. But according to that one, that's showing a rebound from 2024's volume of 952 million to actually there are 1.3 billion after a 20% drop in 2023. And by donor, so showing this chart, you can see from the figure that EU, World Bank, the World Bank, United States, and EU report somewhat similarly across both systems, although CRS, so the blue bar, only stops at 2023. Whereas Germany, for example, data show a little bit matching trend, but different times in terms of volumes because of reporting gaps. And this shows at least the potential to report the volume using IATI. Next one, please. And finally, the comparability between CRS and FTS. So they, both the CRS and FTS data show a similar pattern. And education financing in crisis context rose quickly between 2016 and 2021 in both databases by about $700 million, but then dropped by roughly 20% in the year that followed. The two data sources differ in terms of volume, and that's because the CRS volumes are about 1/3 higher than the FTS. It's a reason for the development and humanitarian disbursements are included in the CRS, while the FTS tracks mainly on the humanitarian funding, which creates this gap. So these are the global analysis, and I'm going to hand over to Francesca to talk about the country cases as well as the thematic analysis.
Good morning, colleagues. It's like I'm not only presenting, I'm also sharing slides, and it's not necessarily always an easy task. Voila. So for those who, So my name is Francesca Pidna, and I work at ECW in Christian's team, but I'm also the French seconded to ECW. And so we'll talk more in this part of the presentation more about how ECW really tried to approach this analysis more from a country perspective, and specifically looking into countries that we know are, of course, affected by protracted crises, without necessarily differentiating what is EAPC funding and more development funding. We really wanted to look at the overall flow of funding to the education sector in these countries. So when I talk about countries for the policy paper, we really looked into 6 countries, which we call the 6 pilot countries. As Yuki mentioned, we looked at Haiti, the Democratic Republic of Congo, we looked at Ethiopia, we looked at South Sudan, we looked at Chad, and we looked at Nigeria. But in these slides, we'll show you also a little bit of the analyses, which includes 5 additional countries, mainly Afghanistan, Ukraine, Somalia, Sudan, and Palestine. Because in the meantime, we did expand the analysis to this broader group. Overall, what we did is that we looked mainly at FTS and IATI, which we merged. And not only did we merge them, but we really tried to do our best to also filter out any kind of duplicates, mostly manually, to also understand ultimately how the donors were reporting across the different data sets, and making sure that we could really analyze a comprehensive data set that was as clean as possible. Overall, we were able to have a database made of $7.4 billion across these 11 countries, of which 72% were coming from IATI, which of course is an interesting finding in itself, considering the high level of emergencies that these countries are dealing with. While we were doing the analyses, we always had in the back of our mind, how can we make these analyses and these data compilation as useful as possible to practitioners such as ourselves, which, we are the EAPC fund globally in order to use, or let's say be inspired by these findings to support our decision making. But also we were thinking about the practitioners that work in the context in which we operate. How can we support them in providing them information that can really give them a foundation to not only drive decision making, but ultimately support coordination and collaboration among both humanitarian and development partners at different levels. So this is, for example, the first element that this compilation really supported us in doing, is that really mapping the broader landscape of education financing in these highly emergency-prone contexts. I just want to say that, first of all, in this analysis, we do not have the GPE, unfortunately, because the GPE data, in fact, is not found in FTS or IATI. They use another kind of data set to track their financing. So that's the only reason why GPE is here, not because, of course, they don't provide funding to the education sector in these contexts. But ultimately, this flowchart really demonstrates the volume of education funding that is going to these countries from different donors, which may be a little bit surprising among the different stakeholders working in these contexts, particularly the volume of World Bank grants that is going to these contexts, but also, of course, United States and ECHO and Germany and so forth. So as a donor, can this kind of understanding of the wider landscape really support us in defining where our funds can be most impactful? But also as a practitioner or a minister of education or whoever, how can we have a better understanding of what funds can be leveraged in a total package for the education sector in these contexts, when of course ODA to education overall is definitely shrinking. Another kind of interesting insights that this kind of compilation provides us is ultimately how we are defining what is humanitarian, but also humanitarian funding and what is not humanitarian funding, and how that, of course, somewhat influences or transpires in the way this financing is tracked. So in compiling the data from these data sets across these, again, highly emergency-prone countries, we see that 46% of the fund overall is considered humanitarian. And this includes, of course, FTS funding, but also funding that was not an FTS, but was flagged as humanitarian in IATI. 88% of the humanitarian funding definitely, in this analysis comes from FTS, which clearly demonstrates that FTS does remain a strong reference for everything related to humanitarian finance tracking. However, what is interesting is that within FTS, 74% of this data is indicated as funding going to the coordinated appeals. And this, for us, is just a moment of reflection, especially as there is a humanitarian reset. And it's very likely, in fact, that the coordinated appeals will be smaller, requesting less funds channeled through these appeals. Therefore, what will be the implications on how we identify humanitarian financing if they will not be, in fact, channeled through the humanitarian appeals? Overall, also, I think this snapshot ultimately demonstrates that if we just reference the typical traditional finance trackers, such as the humanitarian finance trackers, such as FTS, in these contexts, we may very well be overlooking a large amount of funding that is going to the education sector that may very well be relevant to common priorities. IATI also provides something that OHA-FTS doesn't, which is a little bit more of detail in terms of the subsectors that are funded within the education sector. So in fact, in IATI, we can find, of course, all the funding that is labeled across the sector names, which are DAC codes, so specific codes that identify, which subsector of the education system is being funded. And what we can do is that, of course, we can have an overview of where the funding is going in terms of these levels of education, and of course, then provide a little bit more deeper analysis of who is funding what. And again, I think it really depends on who is approaching this kind of analysis and these kind of data, and of course, also these kind of tools to really support and maybe the identification of donors that maybe we are unaware are in fact financing things that are of interest to your specific mandate. So for example, if you are an actor working in Ethiopia, specifically in relation to vocational training, if you had access to this kind of compiled information, can this give you more ideas or direction towards who, could provide additional funding, but also where synergies can be built? Something interesting just about this is of education. So education and emergencies, in fact, is a subsector, specifically also in IATI. And for this purpose of the analysis, we put all FTS funding in the sector. But 17% of all the education and emergencies funding tagged as such in this analysis was not an FTS. So just to say that there is, important funding, again, that may not be reached, let's say, only through FTS. So I think this was already just a country level analysis by subsectors, thinking that it could provide a little bit more insight on how funding is being channeled at the country level. Another thing that we tried doing, similar to also what Yuki was presenting earlier in her part of the presentation, was that we tried to apply some keywords to the entire data set to really understand how much of that funding that we compiled maybe had keywords in their titles or descriptions related to key thematic priorities for the EAPC sector, just to see how much of the funding was related to these topics that may be missed, let's say, but also to understand ultimately what are some donor not just behaviors, but interests across the board around these topics. So overall, I think it's about 50% of the whole financing was triggered by at least one keyword. So again, I mean, we are very aware of the limitations of this analysis, but let's say it's more aspirational, right? I mean, can this be a method for us to identify some synergies or opportunities for collaboration among stakeholders, but also donors across specific themes? Of the funding that was triggered at least once, the category of gender was the category of keywords that was most triggering. And so, for example, here we can see how, to what extent the funds that we compiled were triggered by the different keywords and by different donors. So, for example, here we see the World Bank, and then we click and we see also where they are funding the most, and that have a priority related to gender. Another limitation, for full transparency about this, is that the funding is triggered based on the quality of how it is reported on the data sets. So because this is just about keywords, it may very well be that some funding wasn't triggered by this keyword simply because of the absence of a keyword in the description. Or also maybe there was a keyword in the description or the title, but we don't have sufficient details of actually how the program itself was designed, therefore the extent to which it had gender-related components. But yet we feel that it's definitely an opportunity just to understand where priorities are attracting, let's say, funds, but also where are some gaps among the different categories. So for example, even here we see displacement. So across the 11 countries, who are, let's say, the donors that are most triggered by these keywords across the 11 countries? Can this provide some interesting insight that practitioners may not know? This is definitely something that we hope, and we hope that tools such as these ones can really support better decision-making and coordination in these contexts where the financing ecosystem is so crowded and sometimes, unfortunately, disjointed for different reasons. So this is also another, I'm going to go very quickly. This is a heat map related to the way the funds were triggered by the different keywords. So this heat map should be read by column. So for example, here we see the first column, which is the column of the displacement triggered funds. To what extent they were also triggered by other categories, such as, for example, gender, specific, conflict affected regions. Keywords, inclusion, out-of-school children, protection keywords. If we look at, for example, the column related to gender, we see that 39% had specific humanitarian crisis language in their titles or descriptions. We also see that 46% of the triggered funds by gender also have keywords related to quality learning, 4% really related to protection, 0% related to teachers, and so forth. So I think this for us is just a case to be made of what kind of insights we can get out of if, in fact, we had the opportunity to compile all this information, make it accessible, but also having kind of use cases always in mind as we go through the process. And I think now I hand over to Christian for the lessons learned of this exercise.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Francesca and Yuki and Catherine. In our joint policy paper, we have captured some of these learnings. And Yuki mentioned the reduction of the share of out of the education aid that is humanitarian in such crisis being so small with 8%. I think we employed a specific methodology of singling out what is humanitarian development. And there were long debates. What should we go by interventions? What categories, what codes do we use? That's one way of doing this. But overall, as Yuki highlighted, it's inconsistent, the reporting standards across these databases. That makes actually the boundaries, where the boundaries between humanitarian and development are in our education aid in crisis context, very blurred. Rehabilitation of learning spaces. Is this in one context, it might be a development intervention, in another, it might be a humanitarian. Oftentimes it's more institutional. So while we found that this share is quite low, what we can take is that over time, development, first of all, development aid in crisis related education aid is a large share. Whether it's exactly 92% or something lower, that because of the blurred boundaries is not so clear. However, we know that a large portion of aid is from development sources. So that's one finding, I think, where we are confident. Also, whatever standard you set, if you consistently applied over the years, then you can take the information from the trend analysis. And what Yuki showed is that basically development aid, that share actually became bigger across the years. So the first finding in all this is sort of the reporting standards are different across these databases. So the lines are blurred. And that's also what in the end the humanitarian reset shows us. You reduce the scope of what's humanitarian, but your types of interventions that you bring to crisis context might still be similar. The second learning that we had is indeed most education support in crisis context, as I said, is channeled through non-humanitarian assistance. And an engagement in crisis context with such development sources is key. But oftentimes we find that the coordination activities are fragmented of humanitarians and development. And so there's really potential actually in taking the entire funding and enhancing the coordination across these actors. Our exercise combines data from different multiple databases. And what we found, taking actually and looking at how these data sets label and compare, that really enhances the transparency of aid flows and really gives a more complete picture. So using only one of those sources is really less optimal and gives us much less information. And the fourth finding is the question against the learning, the first learning, that these boundaries between humanitarian development aid, where is that boundary? The fact that it is blurred then led us to a long discussion that whether maybe we shouldn't treat it as binary. Maybe maybe the age of where we say this is humanitarian, this is development, is not really relevant. What is rather relevant actually for making allocations and coordinating aid is to see what thematic areas are supported. And this is where this tagging system, the thematic tagging of funding that Francesca just presented, may actually really be the key to help treat the totality of funding that goes to a crisis context, looking at which themes are funded more than others and where there are gaps, both in geographic and thematic areas, and then decide, for example, where to allocate those funds, maybe in areas where there's actually not enough funding. So it's actually framing it rather than as a binary thing, humanitarian and development aid, into something that is thematically focused, that transcends these boundaries, and that helps us actually coordinate our funding in a better way. Next slide. So going forward, Francesca, do you want me to present also the way forward?
It was, I think, Yuki or you, or whoever.
Okay, maybe over to Yuki. I mean, this is a joint effort that we did. So actually, yeah, over to you, Yuki.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Francesca.
I was confused.
I mean, we wrote together, so we know it.
Yes.
I think so. The voice is coherent among us. That we have a very clear message for going forward. So our analysis basically supported. We know that the EIEPC is reaching learners in crisis settings, but such overall support still is invisible in data because the data are reported uh, differently across systems, and in a way it's still fragmented. So our key messages are four of them. So first, aligning data is quite important so that the data reflect the full scope of what's happening in crisis setting and in education funding. So to recognize that actually humanitarian and development financing are often interrelated, in protracted crisis. And then second of all, the reporting standards across IATI, FTS, and CRS can consider applying consistent standards, meaning like even a small tag to show the humanitarian flag in education can actually take as so much more transparency in terms of data reporting. And the third point is the stronger collaboration is definitely recommended among those three large platforms and reporting agency also, so that the harmonizing the definitions and the cross-checking data and the duplication, reducing the duplication can actually occur. And finally, the education financing data needs to be accessible and actionable, so that not just like the people like us reporting the global, tracking data or the agencies, but also for governments, practitioners, whoever working in the country who needs to plan and coordinate and advocate would benefit certainly from more compatible data sources. And on that, I would, thank you so much. I would bring back the floor to Faiza.
Thank you very much, Yuki, Christian, and Francesca, for this really insightful presentation. It was really interesting to listen. I think then let's move to the panel discussion and to bring these findings closer to the realities on the ground. We have a couple of experts joining us on this panel. We have Mr. Habib Foba, the LEG coordinator in Chad. We have Nicholas, the GEC Deputy Coordinator for Field Support. And then we have Stephen, who is a technical specialist at the International Aid Transparency Initiative. Thank you for being with us and welcome here today. So then let's begin. And let's begin with Habib. And I'm not certain if I see him on this screen. Do we have Habib with us? Yes, I can see you. Welcome. Okay, so let's start with you, Habib. The first question is, how do you interact with data across the different systems at the country level? And what challenges do you face with the current fragmented structure?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, my English is not good, but I will try. About the question on challenge, we have key challenge related to the current fragmented structure of child education data system. And the first challenge we can say about the absence of national data governance mechanism. So there is no formal framework to harmonize the data sources, methodology, frequency, and and the sharing practice. For example, the net enrollment rate may be different depending on whether it's come from emise or mix due to the variation in the definition reference period and the statistical unit. And we have also challenge about dependence on paper-based system in many rural areas. So, for instance, some inspectorate or regional delegation lack computers and internet access to operate the EMIs effectively. And as you know, you have also a weak data culture among some administrative officials, and especially in rural areas. So data are often collected as a formality with a limited use for decision and making or local planning. And the last challenge, I can say that there is also an insufficient funding and external dependency. So financing for the data collection and national survey depend on technical and financial partners such as OECD, UNICEF, World Bank, and the DP, CW. So this reliance pose a risk of discontinuity if external funding is reduced or reoriented, as illustrated by the DHS, which financed by USIT. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Habib, for sharing these challenges. So then a follow-up question to you is, can you share insights from your ongoing financial mapping exercise? What motivated it? What have you learned so far? What support is most needed from donors and global actors to make it impactful?
Okay. About the motivation of the exercise is first thing, there is currently no comprehensive mapping of intervention and financing in education sector in Chad. So particularly within the education development sector. So the exercise aims to identify funding gaps between subsector like preschool, primary, secondary, technical, and vocational education too, and across region as well as other key educator. And the second objective is also to avoid duplication and overlap of intervention in among stakeholder, and also the objective of this exercise is to facilitate coordination between the government and development partner around a common financial and strategic framework from education sector.
Thank you, Habib, for sharing these reflections from Chad. And so with that, moving to you, Stephen, from your perspective, what are the main opportunities and challenges in enabling data to be used for real-time analysis and decision-making?
Thank you, Faiza. Thank you, everybody. It's great to have this space to talk about this topic. I just wanted to make a note about the International Aid Transparency Initiative. First of all, it's also, as noted, it's a voluntary initiative for data sharing, but it's also a distributed model. So organizations publish the data directly themselves. They do not send it to a central place as we've seen with others. It's a network of data sets. Why I mentioned that is because that makes it very interesting, because organizations, if they wish, can publish data very quickly. And we know some publish and update their data every night. Others perhaps not so quick. So it's a moving feast of data sets all the time. Also, of interest around IATI data is it's not just financial data, it's information about projects. We looked at the keywords earlier on. Lots of links to documents that are the reports and monitoring around those projects as well, and location information and organization information. So it's a wide network of data. And a real focus of the past few years is to build to help countries use the IATI data directly. So, for example, the government of Liberia, they use IATI data in their local system and their national portal to understand the flows of aid coming in. But that takes a lot of time. So it's a big jigsaw puzzle. It's a real network effect, and it's so great to see the analysis and the efforts in the report, and also to understand the challenges that we all have. So I think thinking about to your question, the challenges and opportunities, I think the first challenge is the expectation versus the reality. There's a lot of data there, but really when we start to scratch, we might find gaps, we might find mismatches and other things. So we find really like honing in what are you trying to look at and do, what can we find that's helpful, what can we find that we need to improve or discuss. Don't get overwhelmed, I think, is the key bit with IATI data, because you can quickly get overloaded with data and not know where to look or find. But the opportunities are really there, because at the core of the IATI initiative is a data standard. And the data standard structures the data and makes it easy to use and transport and understand. So there are lots of different actors and quite a lot of flexibility to the IATI standard as well. We looked at the sector codes earlier on. A lot of clusters of organizations can use their own sector codes within the IATI standard too, so they can start to be more specific about their work as opposed to the more general categorizations. And lastly, what is an opportunity now we're finding with IATI is technology is starting to catch up with our needs. So AI is a big topic around this, and some of the things we've looked at in the analysis, some of the things we're finding, AI can start to help us if we consider it and talk to each other in a way that we want to, and it can begin to find some of the insights that we want and need.
Thank you, Stephen. That's really interesting. And so a follow-up question to you is then, looking ahead, what are IATI's key priorities to strengthen collaboration with other tracking systems and to then help build a more joined up financing picture for education in crisis?
Yeah, thank you, Faiza. Again, a really helpful question. We do work very closely with the OECD CRS team and the FTS team, for example. We've just released a paper, I'll put it in the chat, looking at how we look at networks of data, which will be presented in Paris next week at the OECD. So there's a real active collaboration. The key word is often interoperability. How can we make these data sets talk to each other and understand the ways and means and challenges to that? We shouldn't forget, I think, as well, that they all have slightly different aims and objectives. So the CRS is a statistical reporting system, whereby FTS is a financial tracking, literally financial tracking. IATI is a transparency initiative, so it's slightly different in what we're trying to do, and we shouldn't assume that it's a simple ask to snap them together, I think. The best way, I think, though, that we're finding that we're working together is through collaboration such as this, or with the Global Alliance for Food Security, really diving into countries or topics to understand the matches and the crossovers. And then I think the way we must transport these messages is both back to those providing the data and across the initiatives as well. We shouldn't forget, I think, in many organizations producing the data, they are also small teams, and sometimes they don't work together. Sometimes they're in different parts of the organization. So if we can connect people who are producing the data to the needs that we have in using it, I think that's the key bit for us. Always the discussion. And the last thing to note, we have our annual meeting of IATI in Nairobi next month, and the community is very vibrant, so people will come together. And I will make a note here, we should make sure this report is in the hands of IATI members next week, so next month, sorry, so we can take on board the recommendations and discuss how we can work together.
Absolutely, fully agreed with that. So thank you, Stephen. And with that, turning to Nicholas, in a context of shrinking aid, what are the benefits and risks of continuing to maintain a humanitarian development financing divide?
Thank you very much, Faiza, and thanks everyone. I think we had a very good presentation of extremely interesting findings for us. And actually, some of the, some of the points I prepared in response to these questions were already mentioned by others. But in terms of risks, I mean, clearly, I think Christian mentioned that, there is a big risk of that we think we have the right picture when actually it is not. And by that, I mean, we think that we know how much funding has been provided to education emergencies, and we adapt our funding requirements, reporting our achievements, planning our response accordingly. And I think that if we had, yes, this better picture that, we saw some examples today, we would be able to do better planning in terms of activities, where to prioritize, how big our response should be or not. There is also the obvious risk that we see, in terms of visibility or how to say the image of the different funding streams. On that is one is for development, and another one is for humanitarian. Whereas we know that education needs of displaced and refugee children, well, they were in schools before the emergency, right? So, we go from something we would label as development to humanitarian, and then when the crisis is hopefully over, then back to humanitarian. And I think there is a need for really a better understanding of the continuity between these three sort of phases of an emergency, so to say. And that, as a result, should, I think, turn donors into adjusting their funding, right? So that they can give money to actors who cover both ends of the spectrum, or in a more flexible way, so that the practitioners can in fact follow children from their pre-emergency schooling to the in-emergency needs, and then follow up with them after the emergency is over. And I'm very conscious of the fact that obviously this is not going to be for tomorrow. To address these challenges would require, I think, really a major mind shift at all levels. Obviously, organizational practitioners, but also donors on the structure of aid. You asked a question also about what's positive about this divide. And first of all, I would say, maybe it's not by chance, right? There must be a reason. Maybe this is a result of decades of practice, on the testimony that's I like, when Christians say that maybe we should not look at humanitarian versus development, but more the type of activities that we fund, because World Bank will fund what we typically consider humanitarian activities. And so, again, we need to understand better why this is the case, and there could be some good reasons. Obviously, also, and that was pretty interesting, or very interesting actually, in what Yuka presented. I didn't know, that humanitarian is reported as being such a small share of education funding. But obviously, when you are focusing on humanitarian response, looking for humanitarian funds, you are used to working through certain mechanisms. You are used to having dedicated funds, which are easier to access when you are a humanitarian worker, right? And I think that's a benefit for humanitarian responders, that they know which donors to approach, which funds to tap into, on how to do this, right? So in a way, especially for humanitarians, having dedicated funding is a safety net for ensuring a minimal level of funding that goes to a humanitarian response. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. And so just to follow up on that, then a final question for you, Nicholas, is how can improved data and reporting drive greater alignment and complementarity among education donors and practitioners, especially at the time, at this current time where the humanitarian system is undergoing reform?
Yes, no, thank you. Obviously, I mean, maybe I repeat a little bit what I said before, but I think, really having a comprehensive picture of the funding levels that go to humanitarian development will lead to a better understanding of our achievements and what we really need to do a humanitarian response for education. And therefore, I think, this could lead to a better alignment between our practitioners, or we practitioners' demands, with the funds available from a donor. An illustration I described before, where you have to you want to provide a comprehensive education response, or linking a development situation with a new humanitarian setting on planning for a return back to development. It should also allow donors to better understand which of their counterparts, in terms of donors, fund. This is always the case. I don't think this is always the case, right? That all donors have a comprehensive picture of what their counterparts do, so that they can harmonize with each other their priorities in terms of countries, type of response on the response activities. I think something Christian alluded to is also the ability to better prioritize, right? I mean, we are in a situation where funding we've seen gets dramatically smaller, tighter. On knowing again, like which funds are managed by which donors, what are the different streams, etc., it would allow practitioners to prioritize activities better. I mean, ideally, again, this is not happening tomorrow, but ideally linking with donors on this. You also mentioned local actors. On the obvious one, but I think it's what I'm going to say is very limited, but it's one, you know, sort of positive thing for local actors when funding is better shared, is more open, is that, you know, they're able to see what funding is available and provided for EA response. And that would allow them to better understand, you know, how to tap into these funds for their own support needs. Over. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, and our other panelists. It was really interesting to listen to this. I think we will now move to open the floor for questions for the next 10 minutes from the audience. Everyone is welcome to post your questions in the chat, and we'll take a few of those questions for our panelists to respond to. I will start with a couple that have already come in, and any one of you panelists, you know, Stephen, Habib, or Nicholas, are welcome to try to answer them. One question that's come in is there much data on the volume of funding coming to education in emergencies from states like China or non-DAC members? Any of our panelists have information on this or would like to try to answer this question?
I think I can answer it a little bit. But Faiza, would you mind just repeating the question about China and the DAC members? Sorry.
It said, is there much data on the volume of
Yes.
funding coming to EIE from states like China or non-DAC members?
Oh, I see. So China, as for China, China doesn't report to any of those mechanisms. So there's an initiative in the US from the Williams and Mary University that collects the data on China aid announcement through a web of search over the years, and they have published the data. I actually worked on it last year, and I think their data set is now the 4th edition, and they track pretty much everywhere on any China's announcement on the support assistance, regardless of development or humanitarian. However, the access to the information is limited to publicly available information, so it doesn't come from the official source. But however, this gives some sort of information of how the volume has been, mainly more like in kind. Obviously, support is more reported publicly. And the volume actually went down recently on education per se. But so yeah, the short answer is it doesn't have any China volume from any of the 3 databases. And then non-DAC sources, so the DAC membership is quite limited, but there are also some non-DAC members reporting to CRS. This doesn't actually yet happen to the IATI. So IATI is more in terms of the official donors, that the official donors listed as DAC members are the ones that are reporting to IATI, as that Steve knows much more, so he can explain a lot more. So for the non-DAC members, so there are some like 20 some countries that report or more to CRS, but outside either the OECD members or a little bit more than OECD members. And then there's a new initiative led by the OECD that actually has this TOST that has coverage of the outside. that has like Mexico. Mexico is actually OECD member, but it doesn't report to the CRS, but TOST, yes. So, and then Brazil, Indonesia, Chile, and so on. But that's still a new initiative, so they only have the four-year data, what do you call it, time series. But that's pretty much the other sources that we can look, but not on humanitarian, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you very much, Yuki. Another question that has been posed is, has there been any progress on tracking and understanding the importance of remittances in humanitarian aid slash EIE?
Okay, I can try to answer, but it's not probably the answer everyone would be convinced. But remittances is collected by the World Bank and they report, but we never looked at it. So it's a great idea. Maybe we should take a moment to actually study more. But the volume itself is large, but I don't know whether the money actually goes to EIEPC or countries with crisis. It's very much linked to family members back home and so on. So that's a great aspect. It's something, it's a volume that's a lot larger than the ODA in general. So yes, good idea.
And just to add, again, I don't have an answer. I know in the IATI standard, remittances isn't a concept, but it's partly back to the first question. A thing that I've always asked in IATI in my 15 years of involvement is, when is it finished? When do we have everything? And nobody can answer that because the world is changing all the time. So China is a very good point that China does not publish IATI data, but it is very feasible for us to produce China's data in the IATI format. And there's an active community looking about how we use this data standard to produce data that's about others to help us see that bigger picture. And the other side is the breadth and the length. So there are many very small NGOs and implementing partners that publish IATI data to add their piece to the jigsaw, the network that I was talking about. So it's a picture we can see, but sometimes we don't know when it's finished, if ever.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay, moving on to the next question that I can see on here is, how can external actors support initiatives to support data collection at the country level? And given that there are many actors in data collection, what can we do to standardize data collection, especially in countries who are experiencing EIE? That is 2 questions in one.
I can start if that's okay. I think it's a really good question. Thank you to Joseph. I know I mentioned the example of in Liberia where they've been using IATI data, and that was funded externally by I think the Swedish government and others to see that happen. So it's both supporting the data collection, but also importantly the usage of the data at country level. There are many actors very interested to see this for different reasons. So we'll have lots of examples and how that's happened in the world of IATI, and I can share those in the wrap up for the wrap up as well.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add anything? Okay.
Yeah,
so then,
if I may add something, I think IATI has moved towards really looking at more at the data users, and I would say in this webinar we are in a way data users of the IATI data, and sort of engaging with these user communities and channeling back sort of some of the lessons learned, for example, from our work here. How are the labels used? Where are the shortcomings? I think this work is critical, and it's not only done in education. There are also other sectors, but I encourage everybody to sort of actually be aware of the data, work with the data, and join these communities to feedback and actually help sort of improve also the IATI sort of labeling standards, how information is captured. Because only through these use cases we actually see what's kind of not working. I think from an IATI, like let's say HQ kind of perspective. It's hard to find out if you don't actually use the data and work with data. So that collaboration actually with Stephen and his team, the IATI team, was really invaluable. And I believe even on this call there was this South Korean initiative, like this research report that is really also a great report. There are these initiatives, and I encourage everybody to actually just work with the data set and actually join the community.
Thank you, Christian. I can see both Francesca and Stephen have your hands up.
Thank you, Stephen. I think I just also want to add that, for example, throughout this work that we were doing, where we were really exploring the data set and exploring the potential of really merging data that would generally be looked at separately, I think like my contact with Habib really gave me the opportunity to understand how much, unfortunately, country level colleagues sometimes are unaware of the existence of the data set and really of the potential and the kind of information that they can gather to then possibly complement with other efforts at country level, just the way that Habib and his collaborators are doing in Chad. But I think really something that actors like ourselves can do is somewhat take off the burden from some country level colleagues of ultimately understanding the kind of data sets that are there, understanding the wealth of information that we already could potentially have access to, and ultimately really, just have colleagues not be in a situation where they have to repeat, sometimes manually through very lengthy efforts of collecting data and standardizing it in their own way, but ultimately just build on the information that is already available. So I think, like Christian also said, there's a lot of like this advocacy efforts that is going of just like building knowledge and understanding of what exists, but also maybe supporting the consolidation of this data in a way that makes sense to practitioners that we are always in contact with, to make sure that it says something to their needs and their aspirations of improved coordination and collaboration across the nexus.
Thank you. And very briefly, Joseph's question mentioned standardization. So as I mentioned before, at the heart of IATI is a data standard. And that has changed over the years with community input and community discussion. And what we find is always a balance and a tension between how do we keep things that are a general model versus how do we enable the standard to talk directly to communities of a certain theme or topic. And it's an interesting discussion, and it will keep going. And I do believe, as I mentioned before, that technology can help us here. We don't have to all tag and standardize the data. We can help, these computers can help us do a bit more, I think, moving on, hopefully.
Thank you, Stephen. Nicholas, did you want to add anything?
Yes, no, very briefly on I'm going from the global / systematic perspective to more the country one, but just to flag that organizations receive funding reporting that to whatever structure, typically for the cluster, the one that we use most is FTS, but also to the cluster itself is already extremely helpful because it helps our cluster colleagues at country level to have a sort of live, immediate understanding of the funding levels. You would be surprised, that the reporting levels, from my experience, has nothing to do with the size of the type of the organization, right? We can have missing funds from local organizations as well as from large or very large UN agencies. And therefore, my recommendation for practitioners who receive funding is to report that through FTS or the mechanisms on the cluster, obviously. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Being conscious of time, I think we'll just take the two final questions in the chat here. One asks, how does the finance cuts in emergencies affect child learning across the life cycle of pre-primary, primary, and secondary? And if or how humanitarian response funds are leveraged or co-programmed for education outcomes?
Maybe I can come in and say a few words. I mean, in our analysis itself, we didn't study sort of by sector level the eight tracking. I mean, in CRS, and Yuki can confirm this, perhaps you have the sector level data, but EIE usually doesn't actually disaggregate their data sets into what sector is supported. There's a category in IATI that says education in emergencies, so you select that, but typically there's no disaggregation for sector level. That being said, of course, the thematic tagging is one option if they have it in project titles or project descriptions, some information on that can be used. But then how much is actually usually, many of the programs cover different sectors, sort of pre-primary, primary, secondary. So, and usually they wouldn't report the shares that go to these different sector levels. So it's quite tricky to track that, and we haven't done this in our analysis. That said, there would be perhaps single studies in sets of countries with that impact, maybe even INE, when you had that sort of report that you issued with the Geneva Global Hub, you had sort of a survey done, what I understand, on the impact of the cuts, and perhaps you have some insights. Perhaps it's not a global kind of overview of all the cuts, but sort of the cases actually, how this maps at field level. But yes, I think actually to highlight what sectors are cut, what themes are mostly affected, that information would be invaluable for us in terms of our advocacy. And it's a good point actually in terms of data needs for us to figure out.
Thank you, Christian. And so moving to the final question, do you anticipate any data collection fallout related to the demise of USAID? Will the humanitarian reset make it harder to collect the data you need?
I can offer a brief answer there. We know from the IATI perspective, the data of USAID there continues to be data there about USAID, and that has been updated this year. What we're finding is more organizations are pushing data out through the IATI standard, but what I'd like to leave with is that the initial commitment for IATI all those years ago was about transparency and better coordination. I think we really must try to renew that. The commitments to using the data and supporting others to use the data has to come through now, because it's all good to push out data under transparency, but we need to support initiatives like this to work together to understand how to use it.
Maybe to add one point, when the question mentions data collection, I mean, one observation that we have is that US was a key donor in some of the fundamental initiatives on data collection regarding the needs assessments, for example, and Nicola, I think, has its hand up, so perhaps he can provide more details. But for example, MSNA's multi-sectoral needs assessment, US was a core funder. Now, sometimes another donor like ECHO actually in this case steps in for a year, but it creates sort of a big issue. And also sort of the DHS service were funded by US. These data initiatives provide the foundation of identifying the needs. How many children are out of school, for example, in such crisis settings. If those actually are not funded and there's no alternative, then yes, there are data collection gaps on some core issues, but maybe less related to financing to the IATI initiative, perhaps.
Thank you, Christian. I think, Nicholas, you have your hand up.
Yes. So on the financing data, I don't see obviously major needs between what's reported on the humanitarian reset. However, knowing that there'll be practically less staff, less coordination staff, or less, dedicated staff, it could be that in fact, this comes more slowly, that not all the information is reported properly by organizations or coordination platforms. I agree with Christian on, like, it also depends on what type of data that we're collecting, but when it comes to needs, we were expecting a major change in 2025, and so far the system in terms of collecting information about the needs of people, especially through MSNAs, has sort of survived. At least it's in a much better than what we were afraid of at the start. But yes, it has been through adjustments of donors, sometimes reducing the scope of analysis in countries. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. I think we're almost at time. We have 5 minutes left before we close this webinar. Before
Faiza,
I move, yes.
there's one question that is Pauline Poyi asked for answer on her question, which I believe is there much data for funds that are being delivered to Eastern DRC, especially at this time. I mean, this is one country where we actually are one of our 6 countries. So perhaps Francesca could respond to that. I'm just seeing that she repeated her question, so I just want to make sure we answer.
Yeah, so in relation to that, as Christian says, so the DRC is one of the countries, and one of the keyword categories, let's say, that we applied is we applied it mainly for the 6 initial countries, is that we tried to apply some keywords related to the most conflict affected regions of the DRC, as well as, for example, Chad, Nigeria, and so forth. And so we can give you absolutely the information of the funds that were triggered by those keywords for the DRC. And maybe I can give it to you after, because now I don't have maybe I'll put it in the chat because I have to go look into the data.
Yes, no, thank you, Christian and Francesca. And I can see more questions coming in, but I think in the interest of time, we can move on, and perhaps the team can respond in writing as after the webinar when we put up the recording. Thank you very much. Before we close, I would like to ask each of you for any final thoughts, any final reflections, in a sentence or two. And you are welcome to go in any order you like.
I mean, maybe I can start. I mean, this was a this was a very long process for us to dig into the data sets. It's a lot of foundational work that we, as together with Yuki from GEM team, with Stephen, it created really a community of people really interested and dedicated to EIE financing, improving the EIE financing tracking. We from ECW feel like this is something we want to continue, whether we call it under broad umbrella of EIE Financing Observatory. It's not a giant database that we want to create, but a community actually that tries to shed light on some of the pertinent questions that we in advocacy and policy realms have. So we intend to, embed this perhaps together with Yuki in future education financing reports that UNESCO GEM issues. But for us as ECW, we could have more focused studies on selected countries that help us really improve the coordination and allocation of funds. So this is really, I see, a community of interested people, and we also would like to hear from other people who would join that effort to really have that advocacy for better reporting and better analysis on this issue.
Yes, and just to briefly add to that, thank you, Christian. It may sound cliched, I apologize, but this network of data we've created, it's only going to be as strong as these discussions that we have. So more of this, please, and we will always support this. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Christian and Stephen. I think that summarizes the last points. And thank you again for all the participants. Thank you for engaging in the discussions. I think the examples we've heard today highlight, the complexity and the urgency of this issue. And I think moving forward, our collective challenge is now to make sure that all these different data systems talk to one another, that governments and partners can see the full envelope of resources available, and that this information generally drives smarter and more transparent decisions. So again, thank you to our panelists, our speakers, our colleagues from ECW and UNESCO GEM, and everyone else for joining us today. We'll continue we'll keep this conversation going beyond this webinar. And I look forward to the next follow-ups from this. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.